And we're reading from verse 47. Verse 47 through to verse 62. And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those around him saw what was happening, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with a sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, and the elders who had come to him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. Now when they'd kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, this man was also with him. But he denied him, saying, woman, I do not know him. After a little while, another saw him and said, you also are one of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, surely this fellow was also with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter said, man, I do not know what you are saying. Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. Amen. Okay. So apologies at home if the sound isn't perfect. We'll try and work on it for tonight. It's not the live stream, it's the microphones in here for some reason. So Luke chapter 22 verse 47 to 62, and the title we've given this morning is God Meant It for Good. As we look at the world and we look at the evil in it, we can say one of 2 things, can't we? We can say that God's somehow being blindsided, or that he's in control. Either God means well, but he's lost control, or that everything that's happening in the world is part of his divine plan and under his divine will. Now, of course, we're going to say the second thing, aren't we? I'm going to say the second thing, that God's in absolute control. God hasn't been caught out by anything that's happening in the world. But that doesn't mean that bad things don't happen. It doesn't mean that just because God's in absolute control doesn't mean we're not responsible for our own behaviour. People might see Jesus' betrayal and Jesus' arrest, and as they see it, they might think, well, the wheels are falling off God's plan. But this is the plan. His betrayal, his arrest, Peter's denial, that is God's plan. You might look at the world, you might look at your circumstances, you might think the wheels have come off God's plan for me. But wherever you are, that is God's plan for you. God's in absolute control. He's in control when things are going smoothly. And he's in control when we think that things are falling apart. At the end of Genesis, we read about Joseph, don't we? Joseph had everything going for him. He had a phenomenally bright future. But his brothers get jealous. His brothers sell him into slavery. His new master's wife tries to seduce him, and then she falsely accuses him, and she has him thrown in prison. And we think, well, what's become of God's wonderful plan for Joseph's life? This is the plan. The plan is for him to be in prison. The plan was for his brothers to betray him. But eventually Joseph's released. Eventually Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt. Eventually Joseph's able to rescue his family during a famine. And eventually Joseph's able to say to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Joseph's wicked brothers were responsible for their wickedness. The lying wife of Potiphar was responsible for her wickedness. But God's plan came about. God had a plan that couldn't be undone. Paul develops that theme in Romans 8 when he declares all things work together for good for those that love him. See, sometimes it might look hopeless. Sometimes we might think evil's triumphed. This is God's plan. He is in control. And God even incorporates people's evil schemes into his perfect plan. I can look back, I'm sure you can look back. I can honestly look back at some of the situations in my life, and I can know and I can clearly see, despite people's attempts to manipulate, despite people's attempts to cheat, even despite my own faults and failings, God's plan is working out. And in this passage we see Jesus betrayed by one of his closest friends, by Judas. And Judas was fully, completely responsible for his betrayal. But it's all part of God's plan. We think, well, who sent Jesus to the cross? Wicked men did. Who sent Jesus to the cross? The will of his Father did. Those two things don't contradict. And we're going to see this morning that wicked people can't derail God's plans. And we're going to see that weak people can't derail God's plans for our lives. So let's start with the wicked. We're going to look at the wickedness of Judas, verse 47 through to verse 53. Have you ever felt the pain of betrayal? Horrible thing to feel, isn't it? The husband that's been buying you gifts and treating you kindly, but all the time is off with other women and planning to leave you. And then it happens. The work colleague who's buttering you up and befriending you, and all the time they're planning on stitching you up. Betrayal's painful. One of the most painful parts of betrayal is A, knowing it comes from someone who you thought loved you, but also the fact that it's planned, that they've actually planned this. It's not just that they've done it, they've planned it. Maybe you've even betrayed someone. It's a wicked thing to do, betrayal. But even then there's a way back for you. It's a terrible, terrible thing to betray someone, even worse if it's planned. And while they were still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them, and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Judas has been one of Jesus' closest friends. He'd been given the trustworthy position of treasurer. He'd spent the last 3 years daily with Jesus. He'd watched him heal people. He'd watched him care for people. He'd watched him just in general life. He'd helped Jesus in his ministry. He'd preached himself. He knew what kind of man Jesus was. And Jesus, knowing what Judas would do, had just shared the Lord's Supper with him. He'd just washed his feet. And now Judas uses his friendship with Jesus to betray him. And he's been planning it. As one of Jesus' closest friends, Judas knew where Jesus' secret place of prayer was. And he sells him out and leads the troops to him. And you see the high priest and his cronies, they don't want to arrest Jesus in the daylight. Jesus has been in the temple all week. They've had a chance all week to arrest him, but they didn't because they're cowards. They knew the crowd would kick off, and so they buy off Judas instead. And Judas leads them to Jesus. He arranges a secret sign with them. It had been dark in the garden, so Jesus says, I'll identify Jesus, I'll give him a kiss. The word used for kiss is the same Greek word used for love. To kiss someone, it was the sign of your love and your friendship towards them. And Judas uses Jesus' friendship as the way of betraying him. Does it catch Jesus off guard? Does it scupper the plan? Well, Jesus knew that Judas would betray him. As they sat around the table earlier in the evening, Jesus had said that he was going to be betrayed. He knew it was Judas. Jesus had processed the hurt of it and the pain of it. And yet even here, Jesus shows mercy. I want to show mercy here. What a scumbag Judas is. One of Jesus' best friends, snaking him out, betraying him to death. And Jesus says, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? I don't think Jesus is asking there, Judas, are you? I think what's happening there is Jesus is giving Judas one more chance to back out. Even at this late time, Judas, I'm giving you a chance not to do this. But Judas's mind's made up. And at that point, the others click what's going on. Peter takes his sword and he lops off one of the guard's ears. Why does Peter do that? We're not told it's Peter, we're told elsewhere it's Peter. Why does Peter get out his sword and lob off the guard's ear? Well, because he loves Jesus. He's disgusted at Judas because Peter would never betray Jesus. In fact, Peter's just said, even if everybody else does, I won't. Poor Jesus. Poor helpless Jesus, stitched up by his mate. Poor helpless Jesus, now at the mercy of the soldiers. Satan's laughing. The wheels have fallen off God's plan. Those who love Jesus are mourning. The wheels have fallen off God's plan. Poor, helpless Jesus. Picture the scene. There's the soldier, and he's in shock and he's in pain. His ear's somewhere in the dirt, in the dark, and there's blood gushing out the side of his head. And Jesus calmly takes his hand. I imagine him picking the ear up, I don't know. But he calmly takes his hand, just places it on the ear of this soldier, and his ear's restored. And then Jesus says, permit even this. Who's in control? Jesus' victory won't come through violence. That's what he's teaching here. Jesus' victory in Jesus' kingdom has never come through violence. What's had more success in spreading the gospel? Crusades or martyrs? There's another sign that Jesus is in control here, because he calls out the guards and the chief priests. He calls out their hypocrisy, and he finishes his speech in the garden by saying, this is your hour and the power of darkness. This is what Jesus is saying. He's allowing even this. Every dog has its day. Wicked acts might yield fruit, but only for an hour. And this is their hour, and Jesus has granted them it. And it's not going to last long, so enjoy it while they can. People might profit from betrayal. People might profit from wicked acts. Wicked acts do yield fruit, don't they? But only for an hour. In God's grand scheme, only for a short time, and only because Jesus permits even this. Is there a wickedness as you're listening today, you're thinking about a particular wickedness? You're thinking about something that frustrates you as you sit listening. Jesus has permitted even this. But only for an hour. In the grand scheme of things, only for a short time. See, God had used this great wickedness, God had used this great betrayal for good. We know that, don't we?
We know that his betrayal leads to his arrest. His arrest leads to his crucifixion. His crucifixion leads to his death. His death leads to his resurrection. Because God works all things together for good for those that love him. Jesus in this passage is in control of wicked things that wicked people do. In this world, Jesus is in control of wicked things that wicked people do. He permits it for an hour. Judas's betrayal was planned. It came from an evil heart. But it doesn't take God by surprise. We see the wickedness of Judah. And then in verse 54 to 62, having seen the wickedness of Judah, we see the weakness of Peter. It's interesting that Judas's betrayal and Peter's denial go together. Luke reports them together. That's deliberate. One fails Jesus through wickedness, and the other fails him through weakness. You can't argue the weakness is still wickedness, but you get the point. Peter was also one of Jesus' 12 closest friends. In fact, Peter was one of the inner circle. He was one of Jesus' best mates. Peter really, really did love Jesus. Judas had been faking it. There were no faking it with Peter. Only a couple of hours earlier, Peter said, I'm willing to go to prison and die for you. And if everyone else goes, I'll be here. Peter was rough and ready. I imagine Peter being the hard man among the disciples. I imagine Peter could look after himself. He was loyal, he was strong, he was passionate. It was Peter that jumped out the boat and went to Jesus on the water. You know, we talk about, Peter didn't have the faith. It was Peter out of all of them that got out of the boat and went to him. It was Peter who, when Jesus was washing his feet, Peter said, you're not washing my feet. See, Peter's problem, as much as he loved Jesus, Peter was self-sufficient. Peter was proud. I won't. Even though he loved Jesus, he was proud. We read that after Jesus' arrest, Peter follows at a distance. And again, we think, well, that's a bit cowardly. Remember, elsewhere we read all the other disciples had scattered by this point. So even though Peter's there on his own, he's the last one standing. Peter lasted the longest. Peter was the disciple with the strongest will. And over the next few verses, we're shocked. We're shocked, A, that Peter denies Jesus because it's Peter who loves him so much. And we're shocked, B, that Peter denies him so quickly. This Peter who's brave, this Peter who'd go to prison to die for Jesus, he caves in at the first question of a little girl. In Jewish society, he couldn't get any less threatening or influential than a little girl. A, because a woman's testimony was disregarded, and B, because the only thing less regarded than a woman was a child. And yet, Peter caves into a little girl. It wasn't even judicial. He wasn't even in trouble. It was more for reputation. They weren't looking to arrest Jesus' followers at this point. They were just after Jesus. And so Peter, in denying, he wasn't even keeping himself out of prison. But Peter denies association with Jesus, firstly to this little girl, then to two men, and immediately as Peter denies Jesus for the third time, the rooster crows and Peter's broken. And we read in verse 61 that in that moment, Jesus turns and looks at Peter. And Peter remembers. Can you imagine that look from Jesus? Peter's just denied him for the third time. Just clicked on Peter. I have failed. And Jesus looks at him. Looks at him from, I don't know at what point it was at there, but Jesus looks at him. What kind of look do you think Jesus gave him? An angry look? A disappointed look? I think the look Jesus gave him was a look of compassion. We're told when Jesus looks at him, Peter remembers. What do we think Peter remembers? He remembers Jesus' words from a few hours ago. Now, automatically in my mind, when I think Peter remembers that Jesus said, you'd deny me. I think he does remember that. But what did Jesus say to Peter just a few hours ago? Yeah, he predicted, Peter, you'll deny me. But he said two other things to him. He says, Peter, I've prayed for you so that your faith won't fail. And then he says, Peter, after you've returned, strengthen the others. And I think that's what Peter's remembering. He's remembering his denial. And he's remembering that Jesus said, I've prayed for you, Peter. And he's remembering that Jesus said, Peter, after, I want you to return and strengthen the others. Do you see what's happening? Peter's such a disappointment. Peter's going to have to live with that for the rest of his life. I imagine this. I imagine every time that Peter heard a rooster crow, which would have been every day, every time Peter heard a rooster crow for the rest of his life, he'd have remembered denying Jesus. Every time Peter sat round a fire, he'd remember, I denied Jesus. But here's the great thing. Even as Peter was in his greatest sin, Jesus was loving him. Jesus had prayed for Peter. Peter, when you return. I think that's what Peter's remembering as well. Jesus knew he'd betray him, but Jesus says, when you return. See, there would be an after. Jesus is being betrayed. He's about to suffer and he's about to die alone. But the thing that's on his mind is he wants Peter to know, he wants Peter to remember, Peter, I've prayed for you. You will come back from this. In Peter's greatest sin, Jesus was loving him. And it's the same for you and me. If we love Jesus, it doesn't excuse our sin. If we love Jesus, it doesn't erase the memories of when we failed. But if we love Jesus, even in our greatest sins, Jesus is loving us. If we love Jesus, even in our greatest failure, Jesus has already prepared our return. That's a beautiful thing to know, isn't it? Peter's failure was Peter's fault, but God used it for good. And we think, well, we can see how God uses Judas's betrayal for good, but how does he use Peter's denial for good? What good can come out of Peter's denial even if Peter comes back? How could Peter's denial be used for good? Well, it's good for Peter. Because when Peter returned, and he would return, it wouldn't be the same Peter. Wouldn't be self-sufficient Peter that returns. If this hadn't have happened, it had always been self-sufficient Peter. If this hadn't have happened, it had always have been headstrong Peter. Always have been cocky Peter. Could God have used Peter if he were like that? See, Jesus used Peter's abject failure to equip Peter to return and strengthen others. That's how God used it for good. God has to humble Peter to make Peter useful. Jesus does that, you know. When we're cocky, when we're headstrong, when we're proud, he allows us to fail, having already planned our return. There are people who will never be useful for Jesus until he's humbled them. Without this happening to Peter, would Peter have been able to preach like he did in Acts? If this didn't happen to Peter, would Peter have been able to say in 1 Peter chapter 1, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, rest your hope fully on the grace that is in Jesus Christ? I think without the denial, Peter would have been able to say, gird up the loins of your mind. I'm not sure Peter would have said, rest fully on the grace of Christ. So this taught Peter about God's grace. I'm not sure that without his denial, the Peter who lobbed off the ear of the soldier could have said in 1 Peter 2, submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Not sure he could have done that. I'm not sure without his denial, Peter could have said in 1 Peter 3, sanctify the Lord in your heart, always be ready to give a defence to everyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Could Peter have said that? Because if he'd never experienced against failing to give a defence and being forgiven, could he have been able to say, look, always give a defence? Do it with meekness, do it with fear, but always give a defence. Would Peter have been able to say in 1 Peter chapter 5, to say to those who are young and self-confident like he'd once been, listen, God resists the proud, I know, I've been there. God resists the proud, but he does give grace to the humble, so humble yourself under his mighty hand. If Peter hadn't received the mercy of being restored after failing so badly, would have been able to say in 2 Peter chapter 3, listen, the Lord's long-suffering towards us. Listen, the Lord's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. I've experienced that. He's been long-suffering towards me. See, Peter was responsible for his failure, but God used it to make him the man that he became. Peter's denial wasn't like Judas's betrayal. It wasn't planned. It came from someone who loved Jesus and was determined to stand, but wasn't able to because he was weak. It wasn't planned wickedness, it was regretted wickedness, regretted weakness. Peter teaches us that pride comes before a fall. Who amongst us do you think, don't tell me, who amongst us do you think is most likely to fall and fail and deny Jesus today? Who in here is most likely, do you think, to fall and fail and deny Jesus today? Do you think it's the person who's worried and anxious that they're going to fall and fail Jesus today? It's far more likely the person that's going to fail Jesus is the person who looks at Peter and says, never me. Never me. God uses Judas's wicked betrayal for good. And God uses Peter's weak denial for good. He uses Judas's wicked betrayal as part of his plan for salvation for the world. He uses Peter's weak denial to remake Peter. See, whether it's dealing with evil or whether it's dealing with us, Jesus is in complete control. That's what we need to understand this morning. Whether it's Jesus permitting some evil in the world for an hour, or whether it's watching us fall in the knowledge that he'll bring us back better. God works all things together for good for those that love him. Jesus is in absolute control over evil, but he's also in absolute control over your failure. And if we're his, when you fail, Jesus has already planned your return. He doesn't want us to fail. You know, we strive not to sin like we read earlier. But when we fail, we've got an advocate. And he's already planned our return. Now, apart from Jesus, there's only two, possibly three people in the Bible, if you count Job, whose life's recounted in any kind of detail without scandal. That doesn't mean that those people were perfect, but they didn't have scandal. So you have Joseph, you have Daniel, you have Job, still sinners, but they're the only people in the Bible I can see apart from Jesus who avoided scandal. And what does that teach us? That pretty much all of us, you know, we're not Joseph, Daniel and Job. We're all going to fail at some point. We all have failed at some point. And the big question of this passage is this. This is what I want you to take away. When you fall into serious sin, what will you do after the tears? When you fall into serious sin, what will you do after the tears? Judas, we know, was filled with tears. We don't read it here, but Judas was filled with tears. He was filled with sorrow after he betrayed Jesus. And he went away and hung himself. See, you can be sorrowful over your sin. You can really regret things that you've done. And yet never come to Jesus, never return. The next time we hear about Judas, he's hanging from a tree with his guts on the floor. And his name is associated now with cheats and betrayers. Tottenham had a footballer called Sol Campbell, and he went to Arsenal. You know what they called him? Judas. Judas, anyone who's a betrayer. If you call someone a Judas, they're a cheat and a betrayer. The next time we read of Judas, there he is hanging from the tree, sorrowful but not enough to come back to Jesus. Peter wept bitterly. But the next time we read about Peter, what's Peter doing? The next time we read about Peter, Peter's running at 100 miles an hour to Jesus' tomb. Because Peter's sorrow led to repentance. Peter's sorrow made him return to Jesus. See, we will fail, maybe massively. We might fail in a way that we've allowed a sin to stew and we've planned something in our sin. Or we might get caught in the headlights of sin and we didn't mean this to happen, but it's happened. And either way, we come to a point, don't we, when we deeply regret what we've done. And the big question is, what will you do after the tears? I've witnessed some of you, and I have great respect for you because some of you, well, all of us, but some of you, we know you've made mistakes, we know you've failed. It's public. And after the tears, you've returned. And maybe today this strikes a chord, maybe you've not been a Judas, maybe not to Jesus, maybe to someone else, but maybe you've not been a Judas. But I'm sure we've been Peters. Deep, even if it's momentary, deep moral failure, and we're desperately ashamed. If you're his, Jesus has prayed for you. If you're his, Jesus has already planned your return. And it's what you do next that defines you, not what you've done before. For anyone, absolutely anyone listening to this, it's not what you've done before that defines you, it's what you do next. It's time to come home. It's time to return. And Jesus will make you useful. Judas's plans for wickedness, God used them for the salvation of the world. Peter's fall into wickedness, God uses to remake Peter. God is in heaven, and he does whatever he pleases. And all things work together for good for those that love him. We're going to sing